Joining me on the couch today is a composer, a piano player, an organist, an experimental artist, just a very talented woman. She hails from Canada, currently lives in Montreal. Please help me in welcoming Kara-Lis Coverdale. So I want to start out today, I just listed off all of these different things that you do, and I thought it might be helpful to just start by playing a piece of music from you, and then we could talk about it. So this is something that came out in 2014, and it's the title track of, I guess it's an album or a cassette. It was called A480. How do you call it an album?
I guess you could call it an album, yeah.
All right, we'll talk more about it after we hear it. So let's just check this out for a couple minutes. So I want to talk specifically about this piece, but just as sort of a little bit of background, you are a classically trained musician, as they say.
Yeah.
When did you start playing piano?
5.
And when did you start actually composing?
I guess it was a little bit later, like 10, maybe.
Oh yeah, really old. So when this release came out, I thought one thing that was really interesting is that it came with a sort of score. And could you do me a favor and pull up image number 2 right now? That's the score that came along with the record. It doesn't really look, I mean, can you explain what the hell that is? Because it certainly doesn't look like the usual set of like notes composed on.
Yeah, I guess it's a graphic score, essentially. All notation is a graphic. You can think of it that way. But A480, I guess to answer the question, I'd have to back up a little bit. At the time, I was working a lot with digital downloading technologies and kind of like investigating source allocation, I guess, with media, and kind of like getting into the source of the musical objects I was using to create music. And I was particularly interested in the sample pack at the time. I mean, this was like, I was writing things around 2012, 2013. It was released a little later. And the work, I wanted to kind of index, well, it's gone now, but the point that more increasingly people were working with sound files instead of sound objects. And I wanted to make the work downloadable and kind of turn it into a treasure hunt for people who did have the score. So it's kind of a way of seeing the way that the stems are organized in a grid-like structure. And then, yeah, when I ended up sending out the score, like a lot of people kind of embarked on this hunt to like figure out where the sources came from. And it was actually from a sample library created in California, but it was at this kind of seminal time where it was the idea that one source could kind of like end up at any location, and property rights around music production kind of like started to fall apart at that time. So it was indexing that whole sphere of economy, I guess, around music.
So on that track we just heard, essentially it was all constructed of vocal samples from a sample pack.
Yeah.
What made you think that that was like sort of a rich earth to source for making your music, especially coming from a classical background?
I guess that I was studying, I've just always been a big music fan, as well as someone who makes music, and this was kind of the direction I saw. I mean, most of you probably work with samples. Almost all of you probably. So, but from the tradition I came from, this very much isn't part of the vocabulary at all of like what music is. And when I was studying, even when I was doing my master's, it was very much like I had to fight my way through the academy, like in order, like it's not like this kind of a space. But yeah, I was one of the first people kind of writing on that kind of stuff. And it still wasn't taken very seriously at the time. So I guess, yeah, that was...
Let's talk a bit more about your time, like sort of gravitating from classical composition to more experimental territory. Did that start while you were getting your master's, like in a proper, academy?
Well, I think it started far earlier, like when I was young, just being an outsider kind of in many ways. But I was a good student, and I would say. At the same time, like I did my, 2 hours every day, practice, that kind of thing. And I was quite vigilant about that and very dedicated throughout my entire life. But I guess I've always been an advocate of individualism in music, and experimentalism is kind of like the only avenue that allows that. I mean, when you're a music student, your entire first 15, 20 years of production is all about kind of fitting into someone else's glove. And then you try on all these different personalities and these different ideas and ways of being, ways of thinking, and ways of feeling. And then eventually you kind of have to make your own glove. And I think experimentalism was the best way to go through that. But classical music is also a really weird word, because classical really only refers to like the 18th century. But of course, like when you're classical, like in the common understanding of the word, or in the non-common understanding of the word, rather, it actually encompasses like, anything from year one of human existence, or like the earth, wind.
When you were getting started as a child, like you were not only in this really structured environment, but it was also a competitive sort of environment as well, correct?
Yeah, I did competitions, that kind of thing.
Were you successful in these competitions?
I was very competitive at the time, yeah. But I was pretty relaxed also, I think, sometimes.
I mean, how would you be competitive? Were you like, sabotaging the competitions?
No.
Like
No, I was very internally focused. Like maybe it was I was competitive with myself, I would say. And then supportive of anyone else who was doing the same thing. And it's not really about like beating the person next to you. It's about like your internal victories, let's say. So yeah, in that sense, I was always kind of like tightly wound coil, I guess.
Were you like a little stress case around the house when you had a competition?
Yeah, I mean, like the day off, like performance week or like competition week was always very intense, because, I mean, like even the classical upbringing, I don't know, I guess we're going to go into this as an angle, but it's anyone here who has had that kind of training can sympathize with the idea that, like, the third bar in the second cadenza has 4 16th notes, and there's a crescendo across those 4, and like if you decrescendo, then you're playing that segment wrong. So it's like a hyper performative like practice that is expected to be reiterated in like immaculate detail. And so there's a lot of information, especially I think for a young kid. It's not really like a freeing sense of music production, I would say.
What was your first real exposure to finding freedom in music? Like, when did you first start to veer out of just playing piano and doing these competitions?
I mean, I actually had a lot of avenues for just doing weird stuff at home. I played other instruments a lot that there was no pressure around, or like no existing like tradition. I guess that's kind of the problem. Like when you have tradition around an instrument, like there's this whole, it's not really a problem. It can be very beautiful, but there's an entire like technique library, I guess. But I had an accordion around that I like shredded a lot, and that was fun. And I had one of the first things I saved up for as a kid was a boombox. It was like $400, Sony Mega Bass. With the singular Mega Bass button, so you could like boost the bass. And it had 2 tape players in it, so you could dub off the radio, and a CD player in the top. So I actually didn't understand it as a creative act at the time to do that kind of musical activity, or like I didn't consider it like something that I would share to like a teacher or something. That wasn't until much later, in maybe 2007, then I got more into that, like seriously.
I think it's worth noting that, while you were messing around with this Mega Bass button in your boombox, what environment were you living in?
I was in the country, I was in the country. I grew up in the country. My closest neighbor was maybe 1.5 kilometers away. So I was an internet kid in many regards, and I kind of, started with downloading at around that time, and those outside voices were very important for me, maybe more important than they were for somebody who was living in an urban area, because they were that much more fresh, I guess, or just like hearing it for the first time. When you're growing up around grass and stuff, it's a little different than street clamor or whatever.
Weren't you really into Mobb Deep and Wu-Tang Clan?
Yeah, I got into them in high school.
Did their stories of, street knowledge really relate to your rural Ontario experience? Like, what did you connect with in that music?
Well, when I was 16, I got a car with my butter tart money. I worked at a butter tart store.
What is butter tart for the non-Canadians?
It's a Canadian delicacy. It's like this weird tart that has you like fold the tart. And I was called the Queen of Sheeta at the time, because you have to like sheet the dough down and like put it through this like dough press. And it goes through like 5 or 6 times, and then you like stamp out these little like circular things, and then you like put them into a pan. So I was like a machine with this. I was the fastest, and I had like the best, like most perfect tart shells.
So apparently your competitive nature extended outside of the piano realm.
Yeah, I like speed and like repetitive things.
And while you were growing up in the country and doing piano competitions and listening to Mobb Deep at home.
Yeah, that's why I started talking about the butter tarts, because rap sounds really good in the car. So I was like, I always had like the big CD Bible and just like listening to good shit. Yeah.
Was it the lyrics or was it the music?
It's the music. But it was also the lyrics. I mean, I knew them, but generally with music, I'm much more of a sonic person than a textual one. So like I comprehend the inflection of the voice and like the delivery and the intent and like the emotional weight behind it, but like the actual word itself is kind of like register second. So yeah, but I loved the productions, and I was always trying to make them on the piano and like whatever I had around. But of course, like you quite quickly discover that you can't like capture hell on earth like on your acoustic piano in your living room. Like, so then there was another like avenue of like, okay, how do I enrich things I make with kind of the artifact of recording technology? And yeah, I think that rap production was the very first like electronic music I really listened to and like yeah, was into in that regard.
I really like the idea of you trying to recreate like RZA beats on piano at home, especially because I know you were also actively playing at the church. Can you tell me a bit about the role that the church had in your upbringing and in your musical story?
Yeah, so when I was 14, I started as a church organist. And that was a funny time. I mean, it was kind of rough at first because there's so much repertoire to learn. Like I remember being overwhelmed for many weeks and being like, this is too much for me. But after a while, you just learn all the music and then it just kind of comes out. But my family is also part Estonian, so I grew up going to Estonian school and Estonian church and stuff like that. So Estonian summer camp. So this was an Estonian church, so it's not very many people there, I guess. And anyways, I was already playing. They would ask me to play piano often and accompany people just as a way to like exercise my ability, I guess. And then the organist who was there, Eva Rammo, she eventually just asked me if I wanted to take over, and I said sure. So it was a good job for me, actually, for many, many years. I was there for like quite a minute.
Are you religious, or were you religious personally at the time?
I wanted to play music, and the pipe organ was an amazing instrument. I mean, I still think of it as the first synthesizer. It is the first synthesizer. And like it was actually quite integral for how I started thinking about layering sounds and pitches and thinking about timbral writing instead of just harmonic writing, of course, because the vocabulary of the piano is quite monochromatic. So to think about how I could, like, you know, Bandonian or throw some flutes or diapason or all these like different textures and colors was like really interesting world. And then also with the bass footboard was also really interesting for me. So I wouldn't say that it was like no, it wasn't a religious calling or anything. I think most organists would agree that it's kind of more of a musical calling, I guess.
Was it ever strange to be playing your music in an environment that comes with, you know, a lot of, let's say, historical baggage and a lot of like philosophical baggage as well? I mean, because I assume, you know, you're waiting in between sermons to play your music, but you're still hearing the sermons each week.
Yeah, I think it's a little different for me also because the services were in another language.
Were they in Estonian?
They were, but I mean, I speak Estonian, but the language used in church is kind of like another level. And I just kind of be like preparing my things in my head for like when I had to play. Sure, there's a certain tone there, and I think the architecture is one of them, of the space and kind of like the arrangement, like the way that with the organ your back is always turned to everybody rather than in other performance situations you're facing. So there's kind of like a degree of anonymity, I think, that comes with performing, at least in the church tradition I was working in. That kind of comes with it, that you're there to share like a musical object rather than like your personal object, I guess. But ultimately, I think that kind of just made my music better. More better.
Well, you've mentioned the role of like Estonian culture and identity, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But first, I thought we should play something. This is from a piece that you put together in Estonia, I believe, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Estonian Republic. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you tell me just a bit about this project, and then we'll listen to some of it?
Yeah, this project was last year, and the director of the first Estonian speaking theater got in touch with me because he was interested in doing a work around language exclusively, and kind of the multiplicity of language, the idea of like what comes first, like the natural world or like the language we use to describe the natural world, and like all these kind of like meta ideas around communication, I would say. And so he got in touch with me because I talk about vocal work a lot, and kind of the manipulation of the voice and altering sonic identity in ways that can kind of like flip meaning, I guess. And we started working on it last year, and I ended up focusing more on, well, actually the work originally was meant to investigate the early 20th century, because there was a massive explosion with like the technological revolution at the time. There was a lot of growth in the sciences, medical sciences, and so kind of all over the world, there was a massive expansion of language generally, but in Estonia in particular, there was kind of a language father, they call him. And there's many different linguists have different approaches to the expansion of language. It's very individualized, but with Estonia, they tend to expand language from within language, so it's an internal growth. But I wanted to focus on the hyper-futuristic aspect of Estonian economy. Word keeps coming up today. But there's a lot of, Estonia is the first digital ID nation, and they invented Skype, and there's lots of super modern things going on there, but they're also like a medieval culture in many ways. So it's this like hyper-future, hyper-past dichotomy. And so I found this coding book one time when I was coming back from Česis actually, in Latvia, and I was on the train after this crazy night in Česis, and coming back to work on the piece, and I found this coding book in an old Russian-built train station, in a kind of like a weird open library. It was very surreal, the whole encounter with this library in the train station. It was so deserted but immaculate, and that it was like coming out of Soviet times. And then this coding book appeared, and then for the work, I ended up extracting several excerpts from within that book. And then I had these singers from the theater sing them out. So that's what this is.
All right, simple concept. What's the name of this piece?
The name of the entire piece is Marjamaa laulud, which is, it's like songs of this country, I guess you could say.
All right, let's listen. Just for reference, the piece is 29 minutes long. We're only going to hear the first 4 or 5 minutes of it, so let's check this out. Can you tell us the name of that piece again? Because I can't pronounce Estonian.
Marjamaa laulud.
And just to clarify, so the voices we heard there was an Estonian choir reciting phrases that you got from a coding book.
Written in Estonian, yes.
So there really is sort of like a clash of like modernity and history going on several levels with that.
Yeah, and then just also like the chaos of my own personal experience, I guess, just as someone who travels a lot.
I mean, I want to ask about just how you feel in relation to your Estonian heritage, because it seems like you grew up, going to Estonian church. Your mother is Estonian. You learned the language, but you grew up in Canada. So, did you feel Estonian when you were growing up, or did it feel just like this thing that your parents made you do?
No, I felt Estonian, very much. But everything my grandparents did was Estonian. It was very much a part, it's a very rich cultural existence being, it's like active work, and there's a really deep folk heritage there, especially with folk music. And I was always active in choirs, and I was always behind the piano accompanying choirs. And not in the religious sense at all, and I'm talking like folk choirs. Like my mom has several folk choir records that she recorded with her buddies when she was a teenager. Beautiful records with amazing covers. My mom did all the graphic design and calligraphy. But yeah, there's a large community, but at the same time, I always felt like a bit of an outsider, again. That there was a little bit of a cliquey element around it sometimes. And I guess that's maybe where I'm Canadian.
How did the experience of growing up Estonian in Canada compare with when you went to Estonia? And I believe you spent 4 months living there while you were making this piece?
I did. That was my choice. I wanted to kind of have feet on ground and take the time to make something that felt like an immediate document of what the country was like at the time and how I kind of found myself as someone standing in it. But I had been to Estonia several times before, mainly to visit family, but also the trips were always organized around the choir festival that takes place every 4 years there, which is this, I don't know if anyone here knows about it, but it's, I think must be one of the largest choir festivals in the world, but Estonians are understood now in the historical record to kind of have sung themselves to freedom from Russian occupation. And so they formed this human singing chain across the Baltic states and imbued a lot of their choral work with protest lyrics. And they held several protest rallies through song all over Estonia. And to this day, they kind of preserve, despite that Estonia is now free, they preserve the tradition and kind of remember their independence and what it took to kind of acquire it again through these song festivals. And there's 30,000 singers on stage at once, so you can imagine what that sounds like. It's pretty insane experience, but even a year and a half leading up to the festival, they commission composers to create new works, and then they send out choir directors to each different choir all over the world, because you have to audition in order to make it into you have to be serious and show your dedication to learning the repertoire and whatever. So, and then they send out the dirigents or the directors to get everyone on the same page, and then you all meet at the same time, and there's this procession through the city, and everyone's crying, and everyone in the country comes to greet this choir. And then there's about 110,000 people on this song festival grounds, and there's a torch, and they take the torch up the tower and light the tower up, very Olympian kind of tradition. And then they sing these beautiful pieces together.
when you had the Estonian choir singing these lines from a coding book that you discovered, did they look at you like, why are you having us sing this stuff? Like, how collaborative was the process?
It was quite collaborative. I mean, we talked about it throughout. And initially I was a little bit hesitant because, no, I wasn't hesitant. Like, I knew that they asked me to do the work because they knew what I'm into. And so I had a certain element of confidence there, but sure, they had to kind of assure me a few times that it was fine, that I just kind of go with my vision. Because, of course, when you're asked to do a project of that scale for an audience that's nationwide, rather than like a scene-wide, you know, it's a little bit different. So I felt like there were a lot of expectations, or like I had to sort out what I wanted to say, and I had to make sure that it was poignant for the time. So, but I think it turned out quite well. Although it was very modern, I will say. It was received in a very modern way. Like, people were like, this is very interesting.
I think being an organ player, or oftentimes being a piano player, can be like a very solitary endeavor. And even being an electronic producer can often be a solitary endeavor. But you've also done a lot of collaboration in the past several years. Could you talk a bit about why you like to collaborate and what you get from the process?
Collaboration's about rubbing up against others, I guess, fundamentally, and sharing. I mean, it's not really fun. Like, I mean, the point of music is to sound out and to listen to other sounds being sounded out. So unless you just want to be in a black box forever, and it's not very fun. With collaboration, I tend to just kind of go with my gut and whatever is interesting for me, or something, if just listening for sympathetic resonance, and then also sometimes not. Like, some of the best collaborations have kind of been the most unexpected ones, also, or also ones that have been like a little, like, very difficult at first, and then years later you can look back at it like, ah.
What was a difficult collaboration, if you don't mind spilling the beans?
Well, they're all a little bit difficult, aren't they? I mean, in their special ways.
I want to ask about one collaboration in particular. I mean, just to give people reference, you've worked with artists like How to Dress Well and Tim Hecker, but I actually want to ask about your work with LXV, and you guys did a collaborative album together, came out in 2015. It's called Sirens. You actually never met in person before you started making this record. Can you talk about how that came about?
Yeah, I heard David's music. David Sutton is LXV. He's from Pennsylvania. And I heard his SoundCloud. This was kind of like in the earlier days of SoundCloud. I don't really cruise SoundCloud as much as I did back then. But it was a great place then to hear new stuff. And the other day I was even talking about like blogs and how it was like the only way to hear new music, and then SoundCloud kind of came out and it opened this dam of chaos. But yeah, this was just post-blog, I would say, but blogs were still relevant at the time as kind of like gatekeepers of sonic production in like the netherworlds of like experimentalism. And I was really into, like, hyper into digital modes of production, and also just aesthetics generally, and narratives. And David was very hardcore. at the time. And so we just ended up sharing a few messages and decided to make something. And we worked on that record for a year and a half, kind of just by proxy. And then we met in New York City. We had a gig at, can't think of the name of it right now, Transpecos. In the basement, James Place was running a series down there. Cienfuegos and a few others were playing that night. It was like a loud show. And yeah, it was a crazy gig because, I mean, this person who like I made a whole record with, I was just meeting for the first time. We rehearsed like somewhere in Bushwick that day, and it was a real chaotic. It was a great day, actually. And the set was really good, surprisingly.
Did you like each other? I mean, were you worried leading up to it that you're going to meet this guy and he's going to be a jerk or something?
No, I knew he would be fine. Yeah.
So you're still friends?
Yeah, we're still friends.
All right, let's hear something from that record. Again, the album is called Sirens. This song is called Disney. That was Disney, a collaboration that Kara-Lis did with LXV. And listening to that piece and some of the other music we've heard, I feel like there's this sort of grandiosity to your music in a way of it just sounds like it's made for these large, sort of regal spaces. And I wanted to ask, like, you obviously come from this background of playing in churches and playing organ music. Some people call it sacred music. Do you think about place and ideas of space when you're composing and putting together your music?
I think about the concert a lot, and just what I would want to hear as someone who's going to listen to music rather than like be functional to music. But I guess, I think about the architecture quite a bit. That kind of comes later, though, when I'm deciding like what to share in terms of a program for whatever avenue I'm sharing in. But sometimes, I guess, if I know ahead of time, if I'm writing something for a particular event and I know the space, then I might think about it.
Can we pull up image number 7, please? This is a photo from a show that happened just a few weeks ago in Montréal, and that is Kara-Lis in the middle of a very large space. And you can flip through image 8 and 9. Can you tell us a bit about this show and how you prepare for playing in a space like that?
This show had a lot of reverb. It was like 9 seconds. So, but a lot of spaces, like when you're playing a power plant or something, for instance, that's also 9 seconds. So it's just, you have to kind of be a little more patient when you're sending things through. Like to be a little bit Alvin Lucier about it, like consider the media's traveling throughout the box. Yeah, and it's something to consider for sure when you're coming from more controlled, like hyper-controlled production environments where, the monitors are set exactly at an array of X, Y, and like, no, you gotta have that tweeter up a little higher because, like people can get really crazy about hi-fi and like listening playbacks and like mixing stuff. But when you go to share it like in a live setting, like you kind of have to learn how to deal with physics on a more immediate level.
That makes me wonder, with your live shows, how improvised is it? I figure when you're working with these sort of long-form tones and changing reverbs depending on the space, there has to be some level of flexibility to it, or maybe there isn't. I mean, you tell me.
It really depends. I mean, liveness is, of course, a really age-old concept right by now for people who work in, for people who consider recorded media their primary media. And I don't really concern myself with like what is liveness. Like I mean, a lot of these works I cannot do them live. It's just, I mean, live in the sense that each single note is performed out in real time, like played by a finger or something. So I just consider like playback technology is kind of like extension of my brain at this point and body. But this show, well, the one that was up there, there was like 20 minutes of organ improv. There's ways to kind of like have fun in the moment. And there was also a vocalist working with me there. Yeah, it's something to keep flexible with, I think, and think of different ways of, I don't want to say remix because it doesn't feel right either, but rework the memory.
I mean, clearly you're someone who thinks a lot about your music when you're making it, and it seems like there's a lot of ideas of theory and history and how humans relate to technology going in, and I want to show a couple more images. Could you show image number 3? Admittedly, this is something that I took off of Kara-Lis's Instagram. And then can we show image number 4? Oh, it's sideways, but it's some kind of diagram of a pendulum. I'm just curious, how much of your music is sort of riffing on these ideas, these like sort of academic or theoretical constructs, and how much of it is coming from you and just playing what you feel in the moment?
I'm pretty addicted to learning, I think, and there's like, of course, it's endless in music. Whether it's mathematical or theoretical, or whether it's cultural, or whether it's economical, like there's just, it's endless, which is great. But I think that I spend about like 50% of my time studying, and then 50% of my time forgetting what I've studied, and then just kind of like exhuming in a way. Because I think if there's too much of a disconnect between, I mean, of course, like purely academic music is very valuable, and that it offers this really clear, example-oriented, study-oriented sonic document of an idea or a technique. And almost A480 is kind of like that. I think it's like, it's pretty nerdy in that regard. Not nerdy, but just like void of like, I mean, people still trip to that music, I guess, but it's just, in the way I presented it, it was a little more study-oriented.
Well, I want to play something now from a piece you made called Vox U. You know what, why don't we hear some of it? It's another very long piece. In fact, you performed it just the other night right here at the Funkhaus before Tim Hecker. And I've cut out a couple excerpts from a very long piece, so let's listen to this and then we'll get into the ideas behind it. This is, again, Vox U. Again, that was Vox U, a piece that you created, I think, initially for the MUTEC Festival in Montreal, and it has a very specific idea behind it. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I wanted to explore the origins of vocal synthesis, because that's a pipe organ technology. And so the vox humana is it's a stop. So a stop is, like, you can think of it as like a synthesizer preset, or like a fixed tone that's linked to a pipe design. And it's a reed pipe organ stop that has an oscillating component and then a cylinder, which is a tremulant that kind of like moves just in front of the blowhole. So it creates this, when it spins and you activate the tremulant, it creates that kind of mechanical vibrato that creates those cyclical beats in the music. So, of course, it's the beats change according to pitch. So there's only certain pitches that work together so that the beats align in ways that aren't like total deconstructed craziness. So that was fun to figure that out. But I went around and I sampled 10 different libraries and created 10 different libraries from Vox Humanas and kind of figured out how they work and looked at different instruments and then put it together into this choral work, I guess you could say.
And the Vox Humana, doesn't it date back to like the 15th century?
Yes.
So it's interesting to think, people think of synthesis and music technology as these inherently like modern pursuits, but I think it's sort of a recurring theme in your work that you're interested in like the history of music technology and sort of demonstrating that this stuff goes back way longer than 20 years ago or even 50 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people think of like Siri as like a new thing, but this is like a vowel-oriented Siri, I guess you could say.
So when you're doing a piece like this, which has a very specific historical inspiration, where are you in a piece like this? Like, how much of this is your personal expression and how much of it is, let's say, like an academic exercise?
I think I'm all over it, really. Maybe in the arrangement and just, the way I write it out. I think mostly arrangement, narrative, and my own perspective on the topic is always there. It tends to be kind of dystopic, actually. And even though it might be joyful, I like VoxU. I found the technology kind of creepy, to be honest. And I'm not the first one to think that. Organists have historically kind of given the boot to the VoxU. Like, it's the first, you can swap out organ stops quite easily, not easily, but you bring in a technician and they can kind of replace sound. So if you're like sick of, preset 4, you can just bring in a new one or repatch it or something. It's the same idea. But yeah, I was kind of laughed at generally as this odd, like, replacement sound. But I guess maybe that's why I was drawn to it, like.
You really are an outsider.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you say that, because it's like funny to think about something from the 15th century being designed to replace something that humans were doing. And like that story is continued with music technology. You think about the 808 and 909 were supposed to replace drummers and then became this totally separate thing. Do you feel like the history of music technology is something that's important for understanding music in general?
Oh, 100%. I think it's like extremely important. It's written into music composition, like music playing, like everything since day one. You even look at like the invention of the pianoforte, for instance, and like what the dampener pedal did for music and how that like basically gave birth to Impressionism and a lot of romantic musics and like the softening of the palette and what that did for like chordal abilities in the left hand, how it freed freed your hand from the keyboard, like just like the advent of a simple dampener pedal. Like I think it's like understudied, under-considered.
When people talk about your music, I feel like they use a lot of different words, because it's hard to describe. It's not like, oh, it's hip hop, oh, it's techno. I mean, people say things like experimental, or they say sacred music, or they say choral music, or stuff like that. What I'm wondering is, or it's avant-garde, like, how do you think of your music? Do you even think about it in terms of categories? And what's the appeal of making music in the form that you do, where it's, you'll make a piece that's 22 minutes long sometimes?
I mean, I don't really think too much about format or reception. I'm not like, oh, I'm gonna make my trance record now, or like my, I'm not gonna. I mean, I respect if someone wants to do that, sure, but I just would rather kind of come across new combinations, I guess, in light of what I learned about what everyone else is doing. But I think I'm pretty omnivorous in that sense. Like, I listen to all music, and I think that there's no inherent value, or like no primacy in value that are in one music over the other. Like, there's...
I remember one time we spoke before, and you said that when you first met Tim Hecker, one of the things that you guys bonded over is that you both loved Drake.
Yeah, that's true. That was a Canadian, connection, I guess.
I mean, I'm sure there are some like noise people that would really hate to hear something like that, but for you, is it not a different category?
I mean, I think that it's weird when people say they hate a music, because then you're like saying you hate a whole group of people. And I just think that's really violent. I don't know.
Speaking of not adhering to the rules, I want to play something that you put out last year, and it's called Graphs. And it was essentially a 22-plus minute piece that came out, and even that is sort of an interesting act in of itself, of it being that long. Let's hear a little bit. Again, I've excerpted a few pieces because it can't play all 22 minutes. So let's hear a little bit, and then we'll talk about it. That was Graphs. It came out last year on Boomcat, and oddly enough, even though it was this 22-minute piece, I think it was I would say it was your most critically acclaimed thing that you have put out to date, and it got accolades from, even a lot of like the DJ world and stuff like that, people. And then the record came out, and you didn't really talk that much about it. Like, there wasn't a lot of interviews. I feel like people don't really know that much about this record. So can you tell us, like, what was the inspiration behind Graphs?
Graphs was something I wasn't really expecting a lot of people to listen to, I guess. Shlomo from Boomcat wrote me and asked if I would like to do one-sided LP as part of their, like, a special series Boomcat was doing. And I'm a really big fan of Boomcat, so I decided yes, and I had this piece that I had made like 4 months prior, a kind of rough cut at the time. But it came from, I guess it was a really personal piece of music, but and then it kind of came out, and people were listening to it. It was a strange phenomenon.
Is the fact that it was a personal record, is that what contributed to you not really doing a lot of press around it?
Yeah, I didn't think that, I don't know.
You don't have to tell us now. You can keep the secret if you like.
Not necessarily. It's just that the way that like it was part of a series. It wasn't like a proper album per se. It was a one-sided LP. It was only 22 minutes of music, and kind of 3 pieces. Like I mean, it came out of me sitting down for like 8 hours straight, and that was it. That was the music. Like a really late night thing. I often work in nocturnal zones, and yeah, it came out of one session, even though I worked on it for a long time after, like fine-tuning it, but
One thing I wanted to ask about, sort of related to like not doing the normal press cycle, is that you're an artist, you don't do traditional releases, you don't conform to traditional genre barriers, but you seem to be constantly touring and playing around the world at festivals. You have lots of commissioned pieces that different cultural institutions ask you to do. Sometimes when you put out a record, you talk about it in the press, sometimes you don't, but you don't really seem that concerned with sort of the usual cycle of the music industry, but you're still finding a niche. And is that something that you're consciously pursuing to try and stay out of that like secular album cycle rat race that a lot of artists seem to be stuck in?
I just feel that it's really difficult to stick with something. In terms of, like, the press is so slow to kind of catch up with what I'm doing, and then I feel like it's so much work to be updating that all the time, and I would rather just be making music. But it's something I think you kind of have to get a hold of and learn how to deal with the media also. And you kind of have to get used to the multiple interpretations of your word, and how common discourse can kind of inflect or paint over your own experience in ways. And I just feel like with like a few years there, it was like a constant battle with the media, and it was exhausting. So I just kind of was like, forget it, kind of, at a certain point. But that was a few years ago now, so I'm kind of ready, I think, to reapproach that.
And what about with shows? Because it's not like the new Kara-Lis Coverdale record comes out, and then it's like, oh, it's time for my European tour, and then that will be followed by my American tour, and it's all very structured, and there's like a social media campaign that ties into it. Like, yet at the same time, you're always traveling, and I'll see like, oh, you have a residency at this place in Europe, or this place in Canada, or wherever. Like, how does it work with your live shows and planning that as a part of your career?
Well, it's been really, it's been a kind of a wild ride in the past while, I guess. Like you said, it's been a lot of different projects, and a lot of different ideas, and a lot of different everything. Like, for a while, my first huge tour, I was basically touring for like 2 years, and then I would find myself, doing like Elbphilharmonie one night in Hamburg, that beautiful new concert space. And then I would be doing like Venster 99, like the next night, like Anarchist Pub in like Vienna. It was really weird, like up and down. But I think that's just kind of, it's not an uncommon experience, I think, with musicians, but maybe it was a little more extreme in my case, because I also don't, I've been very resistant to having a manager or anything like that, and I like to like do my own thing and make my own decisions. And so if something interests me, I just do it. Whether or not that's a bad business decision, I don't know. It definitely made me very exhausted, so now we'll see for the next few years how it goes.
We're going to open it up to questions pretty soon, but I wanted to end by playing something new that you've brought in. Can you tell us about this piece? This is something that has not been released.
I wrote this in Paris, and it was coming off of a residency, I guess, sort of out of a residency with GRM, who've been very kind to me. And I don't really need to say much else.
All right, does it have a title?
It's called Fluglock Rue right now, but I code all my stuff in really weird ways. So it'll probably be called something else, or not, I don't know.
All right, well, let's give it a listen. That was Fluglock Rue. Maybe it'll change title at some point. Unreleased music from Kara-Lis Coverdale. I want to ask one last thing before we open it up to the audience. When you are composing, it sounds, there's a lot of different sounds on there. We've heard a lot of different music. Sometimes there's vocal bits, sometimes there's piano, sometimes there's organ, sometimes there's something that's entirely electronic. Where do you begin? What is sort of your home sound or instrument? Is it on the computer? Is it on a piano? Is it on an organ? Is it something else entirely?
Yeah, either percussion or wind, for sure. Never really strings. Usually percussion or wind, yeah.
It's interesting you say percussion, just because there's not a lot of drums.
Well, piano is a percussion instrument.
Well, now you're out nerding me on music. Fair enough. All right. Well, let's have a hand for Kara-Lis Coverdale.
Thanks.
And if anyone in the audience has questions, they'll come to you with the microphone.
Hi.
Ciao.
Ciao. When you're looking for vocalists or searching for vocalists that are going to be in your works, what characteristics do you look for in their voice, in their opinions towards music, or how they work and what works they've chosen to be in? What do you look for?
I don't look for a characteristic in the voice, that's for sure. I think I look for some other type of resonance. It's like a vibe you feel out. Most people I work with, it's there's some connection, if you know what I mean.
Before you hear them sing ever, or is that after you've seen them perform or something?
It can be either, before or after, but it's usually on a human level, or on a level of just a shared vision of something, or a shared, you've gone deep in something, maybe separately, but you've both gone deep to that place, and you can just feel that you've both been there. That kind of a connection. But that said, it doesn't necessarily need to exist. With the Estonian work with those singers, that was very high, met them on that day, and it worked out really nicely, so it's not necessary, but long-term collaborations are usually a little more human-oriented.
Have you heard the album Ramona Lisa by Caroline Polachek?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Philip, a big fan of Grafts. It was one of my favorite things in 2017. I'm sad that I missed the show in Cologne, and I wanted to ask two things. Sort of about the structuring of the record, Grafts, because for me it's interesting in a way that it sort of hangs in the air. And it has this serene calmness to it, but then there's this perfect spot where sort of the piece transitions into the next, but it sort of doesn't. It's it's just, it feels inherently right, and I wanted to ask you how you achieved that, because it's hard for me to put in words.
I think that just comes out of like a form of like just years of thinking and playing at the same time. So it's kind of like playing is like a form of speaking. Because a lot of that work was just like one take, like I said. So there was like 3 layerings that I like went over it, but it was more or less kind of immediate. So those transitions are just like me talking like from one sentence then to the next. I mean, it's not, and it's very real time. It's not like me going through and deciding I want like 2/7 to go to 6 and then 6 to go to 1 and like I need a cadence there before, you know. It's kind of just like it comes out.
So it's more like...
It's really bad answers.
It's like an in-the-moment thing, you would say.
Yeah, I think there's, in grafts, because it was such a letting, I guess you could say, more than like something I was architecting for like the sake of whatever. Like some other like external, I guess commission is the word. It was more of like my own thing. So it was, yeah, I guess it's a real time, yeah. Difficult to place how
Thank
that works.
you.
It's magical, musical thing.
And my second question would be, I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but on Grafts and on the new piece you played, I've heard you sort of incorporating just like playing pure scales up and down, but like for example, I think in Grafts it's in the third half, it's like a pentatonic scale going up.
Yeah, grafts is very modal.
Yeah, that's what I was interested in, because I wanted to ask you if your interest in sort of utilizing music technology and showing the like bare bones structures of it and sort of taking these bits also applies to musical theory structures, because I feel like you're using scales in a way that's like sort of uses the scale as a whole as sort of an object instead of just working in the frame of a specific mode or scale, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Like some scales fit different instruments better. Like you really have to kind of adapt immediately to whatever instrument you're using. It's kind of like being conversational with people in that regard, like when you have to kind of like, oh, maybe this person can't handle this right now, so I'm just gonna like close this other area of me. I don't know, just like being like accommodating. That's something I learned pretty early, I think, as a pianist. Like also for like going to competition, for instance, you're expected to kind of like show up and like perform a really technically precise work on this new piano for the first time that like is totally different than whatever you've worked on before, whereas a violinist shows up and just shreds on their own violin. Like it's, but yeah, when you're composing, you have to consider the instrumental bias always. And with organs, they're all very different also, and it's a good gateway to get into that kind of world of individuality.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mira.
Hi,
Thank
Mira.
you so much. Really
you.
inspiring. I was wondering how you, when you work with writing down the music in the scores within, with the first one with the circle thing, do you start with, or do your ideas come from the score sometimes, or do you used to write them down afterwards just to show it to people, or do you write them down for yourself, or how does that thing work for you?
I have a really weird relationship with scores. Like, I kind of hate them, but I love them. So, like with these A480 scores, I wrote them after I made the music. I rarely write music on the score first, like almost never. So in that sense, I'm like kind of very much a child of playback, in the same way that like composition was very contested in the keyboard era, like musics that were written at the keyboard, it was like considered like a crutch, like that you shouldn't really rely on. You should, just have your quill and like write out your phrases, and like it's more theoretically pure or whatever. But I'm like the naughty version like of our time, where I like to rely on like input technologies, and then if I need to write it down after, I'll kind of like transcribe it out of that. But I think it makes for much more immediate music. But also I like to kind of like on my albums at least, do like back and forth procedure. So you're writing a bit like in more like innovative ways, and then there's also just moments of outpouring. I think it's a little more like you grow further when you take a step back and like write things down in the score kind of mentality. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is it most for you that you do it, or for yourself that you do it, or is it for like other people to understand it in a new way?
No, I never do it for myself. It's always for other people.
Speaking of scores, there was an image I didn't get to show today, but maybe we can pull it up. It's, I believe, image number 5. Oh, it's sideways. But anyways, you can see there's sort of a more traditional sort of score or note thing happening at the top. And then these circles. This is another image that I pulled off of Kara-Lis's Instagram. I definitely did some deep lurking before today's talk. Can you explain what's going on here?
There's some medieval notation going on at the top, but then I've also decimalized it because I like doing those conversions. I'm really obsessed with converting numeral values into ratios that are like digitally compatible. And then 1632, just classic like value sequences that also mirror digital and pipe organ technologies. I really like that overlay. I'm constantly working with that in my music. And my mother was a draftsperson, so I really like rulers and protractors. And it's also a nice way to illustrate ratio-based harmony, like from Harry Partch's work. I don't know if anyone here knows that, but yeah, this was just an exercise in ratios.
No more questions from me. Anyone else from the crowd?
I have the microphone, sorry. Hello.
Hi.
I have a very practical question, actually. You said you travel around a lot and you go from different projects to others, so kind of change the scenery, or maybe also like the bubble, kind of. How do you organize your ideas or inspiration that come along? Do you actually do that, or do you just work? Actually, it's kind of related to what she asked also. Yeah, do you collect ideas, inspirations?
I literally spit it out on the go. Like if something comes, I'm like, oh, I'll just put that there. And then it kind of goes out immediately. Maybe that's why I'm so addicted to like producing in the immediate sense rather than like on larger projects. Yeah, and then I guess in terms of organizing, it's just a lot of emails and writing on I have a black book and my computer. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Susanna. Thank
Hi.
you so much for your talk. You said that you are no longer using SoundCloud to listen to new music.
How long? Oh, I don't know.
No, SoundCloud.
Yes, what about it?
I was wondering, where are you lately, like looking for some music in the internet nowadays?
Yeah, I've gone pretty private zone. I guess emails. But I'm pretty. I also like to meet people in real life now. I'm pretty adamant about that. Although there's a few things I have going on where I knew about some music before, just through usually word of mouth, or a friend of a friend, or someone introduces themselves. People send me music all the time, and I check it out. Yeah, but it's less like, I just don't spend much time surfing, I guess, SoundCloud as I used to, for better or worse.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Hello?
Hi. Yeah. Thanks for your talk. I'm Tonike, and my question was regarding when you do a piece inspired by folk chant or choir or any kind of other choir or sacred music, which is pretty canonic and has a lot of history to it. Do you feel a kind of responsibility to take it, when you make it your own thing, do you feel responsible for taking it somewhere else, or how does it feel? Is it like a pressure in a way?
It's a really good question. This is a very delicate dance because there's really a lot of weight there, and you have to be respectful. Absolutely, and there's been times where I felt it's been really necessary to be a little more radical, but I always have good reason, and I make sure that I can face-to-face say it to somebody who is informed about those traditions and cares about them. It's not something I would do for LOLs, ever. Also, when you're an organist, you're vetted for each space you perform in. So there's usually resumes involved, and these are really precious instruments. So there's a certain degree of respect that always has to follow everything you do. And in terms of the works themselves, for instance, the Gagaku, this is the most immediate example I can think of, the Gagaku ensemble I was performing with as part of the Kanoyo tour. These musics are sacred musics that are meant to kind of usher their afterlife sonics. And the show, for instance, is a mouth organ that's made by instrument masters that source these pieces of bamboo from the bamboo forest and spend months making these instruments. And the sonic is meant to open the gateway between this world and the next world. And when we were performing the work in Tokyo, this amazing sound engineer is just such a cool guy, Zach. I don't even know his last name. But he came up after and he was like, oh, very intense. And then kind of, when I started talking to him a bit more, he got into how he was hesitant to even help us with the performance in the first, not help us, but he needed to check out what we were doing with the Gagaku, because it is such a a special, like you don't mess with it really. And then after he said, like, I knew that it was the right, I was able to participate after I kind of saw how you were working together. And yeah, these are serious traditions and they're serious practices. I mean, you're talking about like the ritual of life and death often. So it's not something you joke around about.
When you were working on the Estonian project that we heard, did you have to worry about like appropriating your own heritage in a way? Like, it's weird to think about that because you are Estonian, but at the same time you're sort of an outsider to that culture.
Sure. I think about this all the time. It's so trippy because like the music that my grandparents brought to Canada is very much music of that time. And this is another reason why I insisted that they bring me there to work on it, because I felt like my idea of being an Estonian was like 50 years old. And then I'd be like reinterpreting like an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation. So, but in terms of appropriating, no, I don't think I was appropriating because I've been a participant and I was invited and we worked together literally on the whole thing. Appropriation would just be taking and without having any business doing so. So yeah, it's even when I'm traveling, like I don't go anywhere I'm not invited. It's just like there's like simple procedures of like what is appropriate and not. I guess appropriate is part of appropriation. That's probably, you know.
Someone has to email you first.
No, I can like reach out first, but but yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi, I'm Juan. I have
Hi, Juan.
the impression that you read a lot of music theory books from your Instagram stories. Which one is your favorite one or the latest one you've read?
Lately, I've been into Helmholtz on the Sensation of Tone again. I've been revisiting. Harry Partch, also been revisiting. I really like reading Schoenberg. Stockhausen is always inspiring in his weird ways. And then I really like the more creative radicals. Like I read a lot of Glenn Gould across the board, even though it's not really like theoretical per se, but I think he's someone who really, in an interesting way, kind of like imbues his own personality with theoretical inquiry in a way that resonates with me. I read about architecture a lot. There's The Soundscape of Modernity by Emily Thompson is excellent. She kind of talks about how architecture can kind of form ideas about modern sonic production. And that ties into organ work also. Oh, Jonathan Stern is a favorite theorist. That's more philosophical. It's history of technology, but that text has really kind of changed my life. And he's a very generous and interesting scholar also. He works in Montréal. And yeah, those are some immediate examples.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Last chance. Oh.
Hi again. As you just mentioned architecture, I was wondering how do you think about form in your music? Do you take inspiration from maybe other fields, or maybe?
Yeah, form is such an interesting topic. especially in digital music, because you're rendering objects so often. So I feel like you can talk about, I mean, form historically in music is talked about on this kind of horizontal left-right trajectory in terms of like arrangement of event. But now you can talk about form as like being a point A to B, like in a distance-related orientation as well, and like a 360 orientation, but like in a finite space that isn't necessarily moving left to right. And yeah, it's a really exciting time to talk about that. But in terms of architecture, yeah, of course, that's like, I like to think often about the relationship between an instrument and the period in which the buildings, like this building, for instance, like Nils Fromm's studio definitely fits this architecture, you know, it's kind of like they're made to be together or something. What kind of architecture would fit my music? I don't know. I think about goo a lot, and like wood also. But form is also kind of a textural thing as much as it is a sequencing event. I think for modern producers, like textures, like fabrics and that kind of stuff can be really interesting to think about.
Anyone else? All right, well.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to Kara-Lis Coverdale.